Hey, welcome back to Chapter 30, everyone. We've got one more chapter before the exam. Historically speaking, this exam is not that bad at all, but it is a fair amount of material that needs, and you have to set aside appropriate time in advance to memorize it. So factor that into your calculations for your preparation, and let's get into Chapter 30. So plant history, or the evolutionary history of plants. So plants belong to the domain Eukarya and the kingdom Plantae. The ancestors of the land plants evolved from freshwater algae roughly 700 million years ago, and then about 435 million years ago, then we started seeing stalk plants on land. And the fossil record chronicles 5 major periods of plant evolution, which led to better adaptations for living on land and the formation of our major groups today. So these 5 groups or the 5 major events are the development of embryo protection, vascular tissue, megaphils, seeds, and flowers. And then your major groups over here, you've got non-vascular ferns, which are seedless vascular, gymnosperms, which have naked seeds, and angiosperms, which are the flowering plants. We've already talked about the alteration of generations in the previous chapter, but quick summary here. Basically, you have your N2 or diploid sporophyte, which is produced by meiosis and has a haploid reproductive structure. And then the gametophyte, which is your N2 or haploid, produced by mitosis. And then which is a sperm and an egg fuse, forming a diploid zygote. The figure on the right is probably the best summary for that. Plants differ into which generation is dominant. So the dominant generation is the most conspicuous and carries out most of the photosynthesis. In non-vascular plants, the gametophyte is dominant, so things like mosses and liverworts. In more advanced groups of plants, the vascular seedless and seed plants, the sporophyte is the dominant generation, and then a shift to sporophyte dominance is an adaptation to life on land. So the changes occur, or there are changes that have to occur in plants as they become more adapted to terrestrial life. So the size of the gametophyte decreased, the size of the sporophyte increased, and in mosses and ferns, the dispersion of the gametophyte, the ferns still depend on water for fertilization. In gymnosperms and angiosperms, seeds disperse the sporophyte. And then angiosperms depend on wind or animals for fertilization or pollination. Bryophytes are the simplest plants, and they lack vascular tissue, small, compact, no specialized transport tissue. They lack roots and they lack leaves, true leaves and roots. Most restricted to moist areas, and they have flagellated sperm that swim to the egg, and the gametophyte is the dominant generation. So liverworts, hornworts, mosses. Liverworts, you've got 2 types, leafy and then the flat lobular ones with the body called a thallus. The thallus type has a smooth upper surface, and then the lower surface has many rhizoids that extend into the soil, and they can reproduce both sexually and asexually. For sexual reproduction, the stalk bears the antherida, which produces sperm, and then the umbrella head bears the archegonia, where eggs are produced. For mosses, again, mostly restricted to moist areas. They live in damp, shaded locations and temperate zones, important in reproduction. Can store large amounts of water, but become dormant when dry. In the sexual reproduction, the gametophyte is the dominant generation. They've got an sporophyte, which is dependent on the gametophyte. It consists of a foot which grows into the gametophyte, and it also contains a stalk and a capsule, which you see right over here. And then spores are released from the sporangium, and then the sporophyte is photosynthetic early and then turns to a brown non-photosynthetic at maturity. The seedless vascular plants, they have vascular tissue, so you've got your xylem and phloem, which we talked about before. They have true roots, stems, and leaves. And the sporophyte's the dominant generation. And you've got two groups, your lycophytes and ferns. They produce wind-blown spores. And when the spores germinate, that's a small gametophyte which is produced. And they're independent of the sporophyte for the nutrition. And then flagellated sperm swim in a film of external water to the archegonia. Ferns, largest group of plants other than angiosperms, the most abundant in moist tropical regions. The leaves are also known as fronds and grow from a rhizome. They have a dependent sporophyte that produces spores. The spores germinate in a water-dependent gametophyte. At fertilization, the zygote develops into a sporophyte, and some ferns can spread into drier areas by asexual reproduction. To do this, their rhizomes grow horizontally in the soil, producing these little fiddleheads that become new fronds. But again, because the spores are water dependent, then this asexual budding essentially is the only way they can survive or reproduce in drier environments. But that leaves them vulnerable because they're all essentially clones. So if something takes one out, it can get them all. Seed plants, you've got gymnosperms and angiosperms, and they're the most plentiful plants in the majority of biospheres today. The seed coat contains sporophytes and embryos which store food, and then it allows the embryo to survive long periods of dormancy. Seeds germinate under favorable conditions, and the stored food then is the source of nutrition. Gymnosperm, you've got the gymnos means naked, so naked seeds. Most are cone-bearing. The ovules are located on the surface of the cone scales and later become seeds. And the ovules are not completely enclosed, hence naked. Gymnosperms are heterosporous, which means they produce two types of spores and two types of gametophytes. So the male gametophytes are produced by pollen grains, and then pollination is the depositation of pollen on the female gametophyte. The pollen tube is the pathway by which sperm reaches the oval. No water is required, as was required in previous groups. And the female gametophyte develops within the oval. So it's like things like pine trees. I'm sorry, they're saying that the pine tree here is actually a sporophyte with tiny gametophytes living in the cones. Angiosperms, so angio meaning vessel, so they have seed vessels, basically. The seeds develop from an ovule within the ovary. The ovary becomes the fruit, and they produce covered seeds, meaning, they're not naked. And they hypothesize that angiosperms co-evolve with insects to act as pollinators, and most belong to one of two classes. This final slide here is a nice little summary of the differences between the different types. If we go back up here to this slide, the major groups of land plants, just understand that as you work your way up, you get progressively less dependent on water. So that's how I would approach this, is go through the PowerPoint and figure out, they're all listed for you, so just make a list that makes sense in your head of, from one step to the next, what is the thing that they did to make them less dependent on being in water. And if you can do that, you're in pretty good shape for this chapter. And that is it for chapter 30. So again, questions, comments, concerns, let me know as soon as possible, and we'll see you next time.